In today's show, we're going to be talking about legal aid. Our guest for today will be Stephen Hine. He's the director of the Legal Action Group. But first of all, we'll be discussing how legal aid came to force in this country. Julian, can you tell the viewers how legal aid came to be?
1949, following the Second World War, following the terrible events which gave rise to prosecutions for war crimes, following the setting up of the welfare state in this country, it was decided that after the NHS, people should have the right to have access to the courts. They couldn't afford it. Britain was in a deep recession following the war, and therefore the state decided it would fund proper facilities for defence, matrimonial, civil cases, and of course challenging government and local authority decisions. And it became a recognised system, recognised and respected throughout the world, and indeed even now. For example, the People's Republic of China regularly send lawyers and judges to this country to find out how our legal aid system works. Our legal aid system is a beacon to the rest of the world, and so it should remain. Legal aid covers, for example, police advice in a police station, hearings in a magistrate's court for most offences, hearings in the Crown Court and indeed in the higher courts, the Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court. It covers actions against the police. It covers matrimonial cases when it relates to childcare and emergency injunctions in cases of domestic violence. More recently, as you will hear from Steve Hine, it has been cut back quite dramatically.
Who will this affect?
The effect of the cutbacks will be on those who are most vulnerable in society and who need, frequently, extremely urgently, professional advice. And it's going to put, in my opinion, great pressure on the existing system, and especially on the judiciary, who will have to deal with unrepresented defendants who don't know what their rights are and who don't know what the law says.
Is there any laws that have been changed recently that you can give us an example of what a situation where something used to happen but now maybe possibly it wouldn't happen?
We've never had legal aid for defamation. One of the areas which may be affected by the changes relates to matrimonial law, and that is, until relatively recently, you could have advice in connection with maintenance applications, payment of money by one party to another. In certain circumstances, legal aid will not be available to assist the parties, and perhaps one or other of them is going to come to court unqualified, with a judge who knows the law and will have to guide them through the technicalities of what they should or shouldn't say, and evidence which is or isn't required in any given case. The savings will appear to be higher. It may end up being a case of saving 50p and costing £50.
In a future episode, we will be talking to a family lawyer who practices both in the field of legal aid, family law and privately funded family cases, and she will give us more information and her opinions on the legal aid cutbacks.
If you have any questions that you would like to...
Yes. If you have any questions for that lawyer, Denise Lester, who's a very high profile family lawyer, then please email either Julian Young at jylaw.co.uk or Judy Ramjeet at jylaw.co.uk, or send a tweet to Julian.
I am the lawyer with attitude, capital T for the and then LWA. So that's how you'll find me, Julian Young, with the @ sign and then the LWA. And we'll try and include as much as we can in the appropriate episode. This evening we're privileged to have with us Steve Hine. He's director of the Legal Action Group, one of the most important pressure groups dealing with legal aid and the general way in which legal processes are dealt with in this country. Steve, welcome to Lawyers with Attitude.
Hi Julian.
Well, you have an interesting history, don't you? How you came into the law?
Well, I'm a sort of a creature of the not-for-profit sector. Then I moved over to the Law Centres movement and eventually became the director of the Law Centres Federation. And that got me very much involved in legal policy and access to justice campaigning.
And of course, access to justice and legal aid now is the hot topic?
It certainly has been over the last 12 months, but certainly I've been involved in legal aid policy for 10 or 11 years, and I've never known a sympathetic government, it would be fair to say.
Yes, I suppose the rot started with Jack Straw and his ideas about cutting back, and we've suffered since then.
Yeah, certainly the New Labour made some very unfortunate noises, let's say, about legal aid. Certainly I remember well, early in his time as Prime Minister, Tony Blair speaking to the Labour Party conference and saying, we'll stop the legal aid gravy train. And so there was, certainly in that period, there was the seeds of sort of this hostility towards legal aid as a public service being sown.
Yes, I'm intrigued to find out what time does that gravy train leave the platform, because I'd like to be honest, please, in the foreseeable future.
Well, one of the problems that I think we had in the policy world around legal aid is, and you will recall, 20 years ago, there was abuse of the Green Form scheme, and there were some sort of high-profile cases of solicitors being prosecuted for fraud against legal aid. And I think that gave sort of the political cover for what followed, but it certainly is not the case now, and hasn't been for some years, that there's widespread abuse, if there ever was. I think there was some very blatant cases where there was abuse of the scheme, and unfortunately they got a lot of publicity, and they certainly coloured politicians' idea of what legal aid lawyers do and what they do in terms of what they claim from the system, because the fat cat lawyer is largely a myth in legal aid and has been for quite a number of years.
Of course, we haven't had an increase for over 10-15 years now. In fact, we have reductions in the last few years.
Yeah, certainly on the criminal side, under the last government, and you will know well, there was a stepped increase reduction in fees. So it was 12% over 3 years, and you got the last 4% decrease last year. But of course, then last year you also got hit with the 10% reduction under the LASPO bill, and that was introduced before the actual bill went through Parliament, and it was a cost-saving measure. So year on year, it'd be fair to say, for the last 4 years, criminal practitioners have not just had a standstill budget, they've had cutbacks in their fee rates.
Well, you mentioned LASPO, and that's of course very important indeed. Can you explain to those who are watching what you see as the dangers inherent in the incredible changes?
Yeah, LASPO is, we campaigned against it very hard. We had a very wide campaign against it. Everybody from the Law Society to the Women's Institute were against what was proposed in the LASPO bill. And what we got some concessions, but predominantly what the government wanted they got, and they got. Well, originally it was going to be a 350 million cut in civil. It's more like 400 million. We'll see how that plays out. They got the cut in fees, the 10% cut in fees, which went across the board. And so we've seen the legal aid budget, it's planned to reduce from what was a 2 billion budget, just over, to a 1.6, 1.5 budget. The majority of that will be spent on criminal legal aid, and pretty much what I like to term as the law of everyday life. That's everything from debt to employment law. It's been cut out of the system. So ordinary people, members of the public who might fall in hard times, that need advice in civil law areas, chances are they're not going to be getting it after the 1st of April because of the LASPO Act that was introduced.
And that also has a knock-on effect, of course, on the efficiency of the courts.
It does. The biggest cut came in family, and it's got to be said that I think if Labour had got in again, they probably would have done pretty much the same. When you talk to them, they say they would have been more generous in terms of the domestic violence gateway, as it's called, to qualify for legal aid. We'll never know, but certainly the biggest cut is in family. the biggest pressure will be on the courts in family. It's fair to say that solicitors and barristers are the oil in the system, particularly in the family court system. They ensure that cases are prepared, that time isn't wasted in courts. Without them, there will be increasing litigants in person. There will be problems over preparing cases, there will be problems over getting expert reports. We're already seeing some of this now. And there will be a knock-on effect, undoubtedly, particularly in the family courts. And I do think, and this is the problem you see with governments, they think in 4 and 5 year terms, and I do think that there will have to be some rowing back from what they've done, because there will be undoubted knock-on costs which will have to be met, which will mean eventually 2 or 3 years down the line they will say we're going to have to put the oil back in the system, which means the lawyers.
But you think, will the lawyers in fact have withdrawn from the system? In other words, not be prepared to come back and run the risk of the oil being taken out again in 4 years' time?
Well, that's always the risk. And what we've seen anyway with legal aid is quite an effective ratcheting down on fees anyway and control of costs. I mean, one of the myths you see repeated again endlessly is that the costs are spiralling out of control and we're spending a fortune compared to other European nations. Well, it's actually not a true picture at all. And what we've seen is the standards, I think, of advice and representation even in some parts of the legal aid system has suffered because they've ratcheted down the fees so much that the quality providers, some of them, have left the system.
And once they've gone, they're going to come back?
It's difficult, yeah, it's difficult to turn the tap back on. I don't want to be personal to you, Julian, but you are rather typical of your ilk probably. I guess you're probably in your 50s, you're getting towards the end of your career. You're somebody that's been probably a legal aid lawyer for best part of 30 odd years of his career. I mean, literally you are a dying breed. I mean, there's not the young lawyers coming through in the numbers that there might have been in the 70s. I think that's your practicing certificate from 1977. They're not coming through in the numbers they were because, of course, there isn't the market any longer for them. They're more often than not going off to the city. There are some very good, dedicated young legal aid lawyers that want to serve their fellow citizens and qualify, but they're not coming through in the numbers that were. And often, and this is what you see in other countries, if you take a lot of money out of the sort of the legal services in the public sphere, they go over to the private sector. They might start off their careers doing legal aid work and with all good intentions to make a career of it. But then when the mortgage and the family come along, they start thinking, well, I've got to really earn some serious money. And it is unfortunate. We do have a bit of a drain of people. There's still very good people in the system, but not the numbers that there were.
And the future, do you think that we will ever be able to persuade the civil servants who ultimately make decisions that lawyers have a genuine value other than the rude comments made in certain red-top newspapers?
Well, I'll cut across you there because I just don't think this is a conspiracy of the civil servants. I mean, the civil servants advise. Certainly I know some of the senior ones pretty well, and some of them get the wrong idea, certainly, about how the system works. But the decisions that have been made, the big decisions on legal aid over the last 5-10 years, they're being taken by politicians and driven by politicians. And unfortunately, we've got a set of politicians that are really just focused on cutting back on costs and don't really care about the knock-on consequences, and have basically instructed their civil servants to get on and do that. Very interestingly, I mean, we saw the Lasbo bill when it was published. It had a very good set of impact assessments, very competently done by the civil servants, some of whom took early retirement very soon afterwards, so you knew what way they were thinking.